right, welcome back to Conversations with Salem. Today we've got James Zatowski, a cyber engineer, friend of mine, former colleague. James, I always found it incredibly difficult when anybody ever asked me, what do you do? I would say like cyber or something like that. I always felt like really incomplete. So I thought maybe I would put you on the spot and ask you that question. What do you do?
So for many years, I was working as an instant responder. So the best way to always explain it, I'd always explain it as, hey, when you get viruses on machine, like computer machines, people have to go clean that up. And they'd be like, okay, yeah. So that's me. I would go clean things up. Basically, when companies would get compromised as a consultant, one of the things I did go into is saying, hey, what's going on? What's the problem? All right, let's find a path to remediate that problem based on what we found in the investigation, whatever the investigation gave us. For cybersecurity engineering, that is different. Is I really put in. I look at it as we take a foundation and then we take that foundation and build on top of it. For many years in cybersecurity, going back to the 90s, we started creating technology, and it kept going. iPods, Apple phones, etc. Androids, like all these devices, technology just blew up. Well, someone had to come through and say, hey, security needs to be a thing. And that's kind of what we do. We come in and say, hey, as a cybersecurity engineer, we're looking at it like, hey, you should be thinking about these things when it concerns security, how we can protect companies' assets or even your personal assets. Because, at home is no different than the office nowadays. Everyone's got a device and everyone's got, they have to look at it. So I always kind of talk to those how it equates to your personal life as well as not just the business side.
Gotcha. So I guess if I were to restate that, like engineers, it can be like more of a strategic role, like how are we going to do cyber, like how are we going to protect things, and then like the tactical side of that is actually implementing like tools like antivirus or in an enterprise setting like much more complicated cyber like monitoring tools, like getting all of that set up. And then the juxtaposition is your prior role, you were the customer of what you do now, which is using the tools to actually investigate like cyber incidents and fix like problems. Like if somebody were able to get some malware out there, you would go be like the garbage man and go clean it up for them. Is that fair?
It's fair. I would say, actually, one of the companies we consulted on together, I'll leave out a name, obviously. But funny thing is first day on the job, I was like, they handed me like this spreadsheet, a massive spreadsheet full of tools. And I was like, what is this? And the funny thing is, I think when we look at it from our lens as engineers, we have to look at the tool list and go, how does this make sense, right? How's this tool used? Why do you have duplicate tools that do the same thing, right? So it's like you're challenging not just why they're using a tool, but what's its purpose. So that comes into early strategy when I would walk into a company and be like, hey, what are you even doing? For cybersecurity, what tools are you using? I say one of the things I do say any company or to any company is get your tools aligned. Your tools platform, what you're going to use for cybersecurity is probably one of the most important pieces, because as you build that foundation and that roadmap, you're going to start seeing that cybersecurity maturity that we love to talk about in the business.
Yeah. That's such a funny example that you bring up, because I'm sure you hated me in that context, because you were trying to like think strategically, and I was coming to you like, we need to do this, like just let me do this one thing, which I'm sure is kind of like the life of somebody in that role everywhere. It's take a time to step back and think strategically about what you want to do, but then the reality is there's only so much you can do, and everybody's got like a different sense of like what the most important thing is.
Well, in that case, the leadership was more of the problem. I had no problem with what you were doing. I understood what you were doing because many times I was the one doing the same thing, right? We needed to get certain things done, and the reality is depending on the resource alignment of who could do what, you were just positioned better. I knew it at the time that, with your resources and the people you already had, for me to shift to meet that production that needed to happen, it wasn't going to happen. So I was sorry. I stepped back and said, John, go ahead.
Yeah. It is incredible just kind of thinking about it. Like, when we do, like, you and I have both done, like, tech implementation, like cyber tech implementation for really, really big organizations. And sometimes it takes literal years. Like, I worked on this one, like, implementation for 2.5 years. And it was like a big job, and you work methodically, and huge system doing a lot of work. But then you get into a situation where the need is all of a sudden like red hot, or like somebody is saying like you need to get this done now, and you can do the same amount of work in like 3 weeks. Like, I think about some situations like post compromise, and it's like, well, shoot, we really need this new endpoint detection tool rolled out, and like normally like 6-12 month job, considering the possibilities and how you're going to deploy it, and like in crisis mode it can just happen overnight. But like there doesn't ever seem to be a middle ground. It's either like you can get it done immediately, or it's going to take a lifetime. I don't know if your experience has been different, but
yes, I've had a few instances where, actually, a couple incidents that, same case, we had to roll out about 60,000 endpoint agents within a span of a month. And in most organizations that large, that takes like 6 months to a year. But the demand. The demand was like, get it as fast as possible. So I'm sitting here trying to figure out, all the tools at my disposal to be like, okay, well, we need to do this fast. What's the fastest way? So you're just going through like saying, okay, well, this will work, this will work, this will work. Okay, let's go.
yeah.
And it's just like a mad rush, and it's just stressful. But at the end of the day, though, meeting those objectives and achievements was well worth it. I mean, in the end, but frustrating.
Sure. Right. It's frustrating and rewarding, and gosh, when it works, it's great, and when you screw it up, it's just like crushing. I remember one time
failures happen. Failures do happen. They're not always the best. No. It's not always like, hey, let's advertise the failures. But I mean, the learning experiences. I think in cyber, I would say, if you're looking at it from a football field, we're always playing defense anyways, right? So you're constantly getting bombarded from the offensive front. So you're going to take L's in some areas, and some areas you're going to get dubs, and you're just going to be, just trying to figure out, hey, how can we get better as not just organization, but even as a professional.
Well, and that's an interesting thing to think about. You said, we're always on the defense in cyber. I'm curious what your perspective, because I think you've been in a lot of different technology roles. Like, how would you characterize the difference between like an IT project and a cyber IT project?
Cyber IT project is more, I would say, from a project perspective. By the way, I hate waterfall. I'll just put that out there. I'm a big Agile fan. Hate waterfall. I would say there's more stakeholders in the actual cyber side of the project orientation versus the IT engineering side. So, for example, I'll go back to my days when I was an IT manager. It's probably the best. It was a small company. It wasn't as big as Enterprise, but the reality is the steps that, since I was driving the initiative and working directly with leadership, there wasn't as many stakeholders. I was able to get done with what I needed to get done relatively quickly. the more people you add, the complexity you add to the project, especially with cyber, because you're not just making decisions or strategy. The strategy affects multiple pieces of the organization, so there's more stakeholders, more people that need to be in line to understand why we're doing what we're trying to do and how long that will take. And then that comes into the pieces of, well, what are you looking at from, do we have other dependencies? And those are always a big case of, I have a dependency in like 5 different departments. They need to be, brought in. We need to do X. Well, that takes time to, organize and then get the project management aligned to be able to do that, to where, IT engineering speed. They want to get things done. They want money, availability, and that is fair because that's the purpose, right? Cybersecurity is different. We're trying to either kill availability in some way, or at least temper. I don't want to say kill it. I'll say temper it a bit. We're trying to equal out our CIA triad, right? We're always trying to be like, we need to have availability, but we need to have confidentiality or integrity. Well, that plays in part to, really trying to shape how the difference is. IT engineering, availability is everything. Let's get this up going. It's going to generate revenue. Cybersecurity, we're not generating revenue, but we are trying to safeguard $11 million worth of penalties, from the SEC or something.
Well, and it seems like a lot of IT projects are like bolt-on capability. Like somebody needs a thing. Like I need a video conferencing client, right? Like, okay, like let's go install Zoom or, whatever. Or I need a project management tool. Like, okay, like let's go buy a license for, 50 seats on this tool and get it implemented. And a lot of stuff with like SaaS now, it's like, well, you got a credit card, like you go get it. And I feel like in cyber, so much of what we do is integrated into all of those things. So like I want a new tool that does, server monitoring. Well, now you're going to put that on everybody's stuff, right? So it's not an isolated project. It's like, oh, by the way, team managing this application, you now have to install this tool that you don't want that's going to, eat into your performance. And, now all of a sudden you're going to get a lot of questions about what you're doing and, how you have the system configured. And I'm going to tell you about some vulnerabilities that you're going to have to fix that you don't want to deal with. Yeah.
It's funny though, because actually that's one of the core battles: agents versus agentless, right? Coming up over the last decade, that was constant conversation, whether I was in an interview or talking with, some clients or in companies in general. Is, some they're okay with agents. They're okay with doing a lot of companies, though, especially ones that heavily utilize like the private data centers. They're like, no. You have to, we'll pull the logs out for you, but you're not putting anything on my endpoint. So, that's kind of been a battle. I've seen it taper off a bit because, a lot of these agents, like if you get a good EDR agent, a lot of it's just looking at your network and then going up the stack, ensuring that, you have key pieces across the landscape, the threat landscape, I would say. But overall, it's been a fun battle.
And just for anybody who doesn't know, an agent is like a piece of software you install directly on a server or a desktop or something like that. And an agentless approach would be sending log data from that host to like a data lake somewhere where you're going to run analytics on that information to try to figure out. Both approaches are trying to do the same thing, right? Like you're trying to find and stop cyber threats. And then there's also kind of that like scanning approach, like where you can probe various machines. So like I don't have an agent, but like I can, send some network requests and try to, probe a machine and figure some things out about it. I think that, just kind of drilling in on that, agent versus agentless, I would say 5 years ago, it seemed like agents were like the worst, right? Like, don't put another agent on my machine. It's killing the performance. I'll just send data somewhere, build a big data lake, collect all the data, analyze the data there. And now if I like fast forward to, it's now 23, it seems like the inverse is happening. It's like, don't send the data anywhere. It's too expensive to like
Right.
keep it in a data lake. It's too hard to centralize. Just put an agent on that'll do that analysis on the endpoint. It's funny. I don't know. I guess first of all, did you see that change too, or is that just me?
Yeah. No, it aligned with, for example, when CrowdStrike, a lot of the EDR were rolling out a feature called live response capabilities. So what that live response allows us to do is, in an event that we have a suspicious event, we can actually reach out to the computer host or server, whatnot. Actually, the way the agent works, it actually allows, I don't want to say backdoor, but it technically is a backdoor. It allows us to backdoor into the system, get onto the system, and be able to complete investigation. Like we can, excuse me, we can do different things. Like one, as an instant response, I want to collect host information. I can easily deploy a script, grab that, take that, bring that data back, as well as just look around on the machine and do a quick, do I see anything suspicious? With those capabilities, it started aligning and saying, oh, wait, we don't have to do this crazy, the bridge calls, how we do instant response. It just kind of made things easier, also made it easier to automate, get into it, easier to automate, which is a key component of our path forward in cybersecurity.
It's I had a conversation earlier today, actually over the past 2 days, with a couple of different people talking about how incident response activity is like way down like last year compared to like prior years. And there's a lot of theories on why that is, but one of the theories that somebody proposed to me today is that the EDR technology, which is this like endpoint detection and response, which is what you're talking about, which I think existed existed for a while, but like CrowdStrike was probably the thing that really like took it mainstream. If I had to say, maybe I'm wrong about that, but that would be my opinion.
I would say let's get there. So one thing that CrowdStrike took it to another level. I think there was a few different types of, I will say, EDR, but it was really niche. I know on the government side they use a couple of like more legacy like agent types that would, like, you could do a whole baseline across the entire organization, like the host, and then that's what kind of, and then they use this product to be able to, I won't mention it because I don't have the licensing, or it's kind of, I think it might be an internal tool to a company, but they would just use it in a way that they could do a baseline, and then they were able, whenever the baseline changed, they would be alerted to that. And that was on every system they had.
Yeah.
So it was very niche.
Yeah, you're definitely right about that. I'm thinking like Mandiant had that tool that they always left behind called Mirror, that then became HX, I think, FireEye HX.
Yeah.
And at that time, you had that, and then like Carbon Black was like the big player that I saw. And then what, those tools were good, but it was like hard to manage. You had to have a management server. You had all this like infrastructure. Once you hit like a critical mass on like, and this is the funny thing about being like an enterprise, right? All these tools are designed in a lab somewhere, and then all of a sudden you hit like enterprise scale, and it's like, well, what do you mean the manager can't track 50,000 endpoints all at once?
Right.
Well, it wasn't designed to do that, right? Like we didn't have that that test case in the lab. But they were a little bit like finicky, and then CrowdStrike came along and had that like SaaS model, like, hey, like just put the agent out there, they'll all phone home to our cloud. It was kind of like the EDR easy button. And then it's funny now, like CrowdStrike's getting like totally beat up by SentinelOne. It seems like SentinelOne is just like popping up everywhere. like every
Well,
conversation I've had.
I remember Sentinel-1's an interesting case because, so originally I was working, I think, as an incident responder, primarily for cloud incident response, but I had a lot to do with the EDR agents because I managed McAfee HIPs at one point. But Sentinel-1 was a really good EPP. It wasn't until I think while we were at Booz that they added the EDR component. I think randomly June 2020, I think is when they added it. That's where they started. That's where you saw Sentinel-1. It was very good at that EPP, and what I mean by EPP, right, is that protection element of like AV. It's just the protection of AV. Their signature behavior signatures, how they look at it. But when you get to EDR component, adding that ability to have those EDR capabilities such as CrowdStrikes, it closed the gap. Also, I like the way, I think Sentinel-1, I like the way they approach cybersecurity. And what I mean by that was CrowdStrike kind of said, hey, we want to be everything, right? They even have, different services. They want to be everything. Sentinel-1, not so much. They kind of said, we want to be good, really good at this one thing with their EPP EDR, like their package. They didn't seem like they wanted to get into IR components or that. They just want to really give good service. I've seen them kind of creep up and then challenge, same way as you said it. I've seen them creep up and challenge CrowdStrike in a lot of ways in the industry. I like the product. I mean, I've used Carbon Black as well, and I like Sentinel-1 just better in my eyes.
You know what's funny, and I won't mention these names because it wouldn't be in a positive light. But I was talking to somebody about managed service providers and how like it seems like the bespoke and like small shop MSSs, are really like valued by their customers, and then you get one that has like breakaway success and all of a sudden they become huge and everybody hates them, right? And then it's like this name that was like, man, everybody's going to switch to so-and-so. And then 2 years later you bring up that name and you're like, oh, they're just the next, whoever, they're no good. So I don't know if that like the pressure of expectations of success, like once you get really good at something, you kind of get into that like funnel, and now it's like, okay, well, like how do we take this thing that we're really good at and expand? Your customers start pushing you to do more, and then all of a sudden, you're the next whatever that tried to do everything and forgot how to do anything well.
Well, it's also, a lot of it has to do with cost. I would say that because some of the SIMs, I will mention names as well, but if you go down the product stack, if you look at the ones on the Gartner chart that's way up there, that's the top performer. It's like AWS. You got your AWS, CrowdStrike, Splunk. Like you have all these that you constantly are up there right now. You're starting to see some of the ones that are trailing behind there are starting to catch up. Like Microsoft's really doing a lot to catch up to AWS, especially in cloud space. Splunk has a whole bunch of, a lot of them sitting back there trying to encroach. But I mean, it's really about cost because early on they'll give businesses like this, oh well, we want you to try our product, so we'll give you a great discount. Just try it out. And then when they become big, and they change their licensing. Guess what happens? They shoot up. They become top tier. They're the top tier of pricing, and then, well, when you start looking at the balance sheet, I mean, you know how it is in cybersecurity. You gotta look at, is this financially feasible? And a lot of times you have to start making different changes based on the cost of what you're doing.
Yeah,
and that drives a lot of the strategy going forward.
It's crazy to me how much tech turnover there is in cyber. So like we talked about a couple different, I talked about service providers and we were talking about EDRs and a couple things, but I struggle, and you'll be able to come up with an example as soon as I say this, but I struggle to really see a single like vendor or technology that has had a lot of staying power outside of, I think the only examples I can think of are maybe in like firewall, right? Like something that effectively became like a network device.
Right.
But it seems like in a lot of other places, you know, you become the incumbent and all of a sudden a challenger is outside and everybody's looking to like, oh, well, like, how do we bring in this challenger and get rid of this like legacy provider? And that legacy provider really only hit like, you know, market saturation in the prior 5 years. You know, it's like their lifespan is so short before like the new thing comes along and the company is looking to like rip out all that tech and put in something new. I don't think that happens in IT. I don't think, like, I think in IT you've got stuff that's with you for a pretty long time before, you know, you're really considering moving on to anything else.
Well, I mean, Cisco's been a player in the game for a very long time. I mean, they were originally with the networking. It's funny because like IDS, most of IDS, I remember one of the first ones I ever ran into was like 2003 when I was in the Navy, and it was new. It was just you looked at the box because you know the old box monitor. You looked at the box monitor, and it was just nothing but these red dots everywhere. You're like, what is going on? Like, it's hard because cybersecurity has really changed. Because, like I had mentioned earlier, is we started having all these devices. I mean, you go back, I could bypass security on a Windows 95 machine just by hitting enter, even though you have password enabled. I could walk up and hit enter, and it would just let me in. Like, the security wasn't always a thing. Back to your point of bolt-on, well, that was most of the cybersecurity because we created the internet in, the 90s? It was essentially created early 90s, and then it blew up. Like, I don't think anyone understood how big this was going to take. I don't think anyone realized when the internet was created that it would go the route it has, and that e-commerce would be a massive online ordering where Amazon's really, flourished and actually built their cloud business off of it, which is interesting. So if you follow the tech, the reason why there's not a lot of mainstays is just because the evolution of technology. I mean, you got to think about it. The first computer was built, I think, in the 1940s, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. So we're coming up on 100 years of the first computer actually being, 1943. So the first digital computer was created in 1943. If that puts that in perspective of, holy, wow, in almost 100 years, we've taken this to how we have containers. We have, we have all this elastic, cloud technology. So, yeah.
My math puts that at 80 years, like 80 years on the dot, right?
We're 20 years out from 100.
Yeah, we're 120 years out from 200. Yeah, that's interesting to think. It's like there are people alive today who were alive before that first computer. Yeah, right. Wow. I guess, and I guess you have to put it in that perspective because not only has computing technology changed so drastically, but the point you're making about the internet, like how we use computing technology, who uses it and for what, has been just a constant shift, over the past 20 years. From like, simple web pages with all like the word art and like the flashing colors and stuff to kind of internet on everything everywhere.
Right. I mean, HTML4 to HTML5 was like, wow. It was a whole like new world, but it then added more capabilities, and what we started seeing more drive-bys because code was getting code was getting modified and people weren't realizing it inside their websites, and of course, that's how malware is getting spread through drive-bys.
Yeah, well, now email, right? Email is kind of
Phish. Phish is everything today.
The amount of, and I've said this a couple of times, the amount of phishing that we get is just like,
well, that's where automation came into play. You know that, John? Yeah. I mean, 2016 Drydex. You remember Drydex?
Yeah.
That was a nightmare. I'm talking about every organization practically got hit with that, and you're talking over some cases, I think over 200,000 emails. And back then, analysts had to actually manually clean those up.
Mm.
Hence why we started looking at it like, wow, if
Yeah.
that's the case, well, that's like 3 weeks of like full on manpower. Like to quantify that, it's expensive, and it takes away from us actually looking us as an analyst going in looking at the more important things versus something we know that's bad and just cleaning up.
Do you remember what was it? The I Love You virus
That one
from like
wasn't that
2000?
way back. I was gonna say
Yeah.
that's 2000s. Yeah, yeah, I saw that.
I'd love
in
to
my
get
hit.
I gotta find a date on that. That's like the first. That was like the first time like cyber security ever came into my mind, and so it's like a weird thing, people getting emails, and I guess the whole thing was like the subject was like "I love you" or something like that, and like people would open them and then they would get infected.
Well, I
Um,
think what it was doing was it was turning around user contacts, and then it was just replicating. That's
that's
exactly what
right.
it
It was
was
like
doing.
an email worm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was pretty nasty. But yeah, it was. I don't. I'd have to look it up myself, but it's.
Oh,
I
that brings
remember
back
it
so many
well.
memories. You remember, like, people used to, like, have to email, like, I'm sorry, my email got compromised. Like, you'd get, like, a weird email from somebody, and then they'd send you a
Yeah,
follow-up email, like, oh, no, my email got compromised.
which
That
just
seems like
turned
such a
into
foreign world.
Facebook. Yeah, then it turned into Facebook. Everyone like, don't click a link for me in your messenger
Yeah.
because I've been hacked, and yeah, it kind of
Uh,
evolved as well.
when do you think, like, more enterprise cyber tools are going to make it into the consumer world?
I think we're I think we're kind of there. What I mean by kind of there is, for example, my phone has AV. Like you can use Lookout, you can use some same technology. I think I'm already seeing it by I have an Arrow, so that's Wi-Fi pods. They have
Mm-hmm.
security as well. So I'm seeing it at home. I think we won't see it like the enterprise side because I put it in perspective of if I have a 20 employee business versus a 50,000 employee business, I don't need as many tools. I just need something to help me be more autonomous. So what I mean, not trying to manage every single little thing that comes inside my house. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I see many cybersecurity professionals setting up elaborate security on in, and they have alerts and everything's set up. As all that internet traffic is coming into their house. Another thing too I've seen is like Verizon, they have this agent you can put on each phone. So what
Mm-hmm.
it does, it allows me to track like all the locations for my family. I have like 6 people in here, so it allows me to track all the locations. It gives me statistics on their web usage. It tells me if they looked at something malicious or if some malware event, could have happened. So it gives me a lot of information. So we're seeing it. It's just not used in. It's just not used in a way enterprise would use it, right?
Well, I guess your last example is how an enterprise would use that tool, right? Like there's a manager that reports back on like what all of the devices
Yeah,
are
you're
doing.
right. You're right. That
Yeah.
one it does kind of put more management. But the other ones, there's a lot less management to it. I would say another key piece that most products commercially are adding from security is profiles. For example, if I go on my Wi-Fi, if I go to like Comcast, for example, I can set up profiles. That way, I can actually measure out who in my house has the most traffic, or I can do blocking based on filters, content filters, and there's still a lot of level to it. It's just I just don't see it as the enterprise level where you're trying to customize full on like, well, we want to block this, we want to block that. Like, it's a little different. Me, I just want to make sure my family doesn't get pwned, and then at the end of the day, how's that work or what's going on with my family in terms of not just cybersecurity but physical security as well.
Um, a story I love to tell. A number of years ago, my parents got a couple of infections in like a short period of time, and I think one of them came from like their tax attorney and kind of a couple of other things. But then I got frustrated, and at the time, Barracuda Networks had this free like web filtering program designed for like K through 12. And I put it on my parents' computer to keep them from going to like redirecting to like suspicious sites or something like that. And it had all these like funny filters of like content I could block. And I think for fun I threw a couple in there, and so like every now and then I'd get a call from my parents saying like, I want to go to this website, but it says I need a password.
Oh man,
they'd have to ask me for permission to browse the internet. It was great.
I get that all the time. My kids are like, hey, I can't use Chrome for some reason. I guess there was a content filter that I set up where they couldn't actually use Chrome at all. Like one was like, I can't use Chrome, like, or like YouTube, they didn't have comments on, you know how YouTube you have comments below. They couldn't see the comments at all. So it's like really interesting. So I play with the filters quite a bit and irritate the kids a long way. So
I was gonna say they must love that. They must love coming to you to unblock their online activities.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to treat them like a CISO. I mean, you get blocked, you get blocked. That's a conversation, but I'm not.
Right. That's
so
funny.
yeah.
I'm not going to treat them like the CISO. So going all the way back to your background, before you were an engineer, I think you had IT experience, but you were an incident response analyst, and then you came into security engineering. I've observed that there's kind of two groups. There's the engineers that were analysts and kind of saw, the strategic and the technology implementation as like a path, like the next path. And then there are people who were like Unix admins who started managing security tools and became security engineers. And it's funny when you interact with those two groups of people because they have such a different worldview. Has that been your experience as well? Like, do you see those kind of two groupings?
Yeah. I've seen that. I've also seen where you got some help desk that came out and had some IT experience from that. So from the customer side, I've also seen the federal or where they were like FBI or something of that nature. Like they did that and then they got into computers just because I think that's why when you look at cybersecurity as a whole, we have so much different skill sets coming from outside. To your point, this Unix sysadmins or you have your Windows sysadmins, they do come in and they have a different viewpoint than say, hey, me who was IT manager, I was an IT technician or data center technician and then came in cybersecurity as an analyst. I think from their perspective is they're really good at, and they'll defend their products, their systems, like the Unix and Windows. They'll defend it and take it to their grave. But they definitely have a different outlook because most analysts, we're going to be looking at the threats and not just to a system, but to the environment. A lot of times the Unix or Windows sysadmins, they're looking at the system and then going out. It's kind of a reverse view, I would say. Then you've got the FBI. Go ahead.
Oh, what were you going to say about the FBI?
I was going to say, they're totally... I would say they're the hilarious ones because they come out of left field with, like, their investigation for, like, I'm FBI, like, I see this happen, we do this, we have to do, like, they're very process-oriented, where it's a very different outlook as well, so I've seen many different approaches to cybersecurity.
Yeah, they're, like, very intel-driven, right? Like, their big thing is, like, you need the intel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Need the intel,
well, it's funny, right? Because, like, each of those perspectives is good, but you kind of need like the whole picture, right? Like you got to understand how to use and administer the tools, but then you've got to really be focused on like, well, why are we even doing this in the first place? And sometimes you get kind of like disjointed, right? Like you over rotate on building a robust system, but then like nobody uses it, or you have a really good idea of how somebody wants to use a system, but it's like not reliable.
Right.
And that always seemed to be the trick of how to find a good security engineer. Is like you had to be good at the technology, but you had to also be really good at like the why the technology exists in the first place. So let me ask you this: what is your perspective on like how does somebody become a good cyber engineer?
You know, you did give me this question before, and I thought a lot about this one because I was like, what's a good security engineer? I think at the end of the day, I've met many different ones. I would say what makes one, or how do you build one? Let's clarify that, I would say.
Well, I guess the more interesting question is probably how do you build one? Like if you're going to go into the lab and create, a security engineer, like what is it going to take?
So it's interesting. I've done different engineering actually. So when I was in the Army, I also did, back when I was in the Army, I did heavy equipment operator, which is like basically taking big Tonka toys and going out and building, engineering roads, like pushing dirt and actually doing it. So the one thing about engineers, you have to be able to take concepts in your head or architecture and be able to break it down and then rebuild it. Think about it like this, like cybersecurity, for example. I see open source like solutions, concepts all the time, but if I take that and bring it into an organization, I have to literally take what was built and break it all the way down to its simplest elements and then rebuild it up with how it can work inside the organization. For example, when you're looking at cloud, a lot of cloud today, like AWS, Azure, GCP, what most organizations are doing is putting guardrails in. And what guardrails are is, hey, IT engineers, you can build in the space securely. We put things in place for you to build. Now, what happens with those guardrails is they affect how we engineer our solutions as well, because now I had to take that one solution I talked about at the beginning, break it down, and then build it in the environment with those guardrails in place so that way it can be effective. So you actually have to understand the architecture and technology to break it all the way down and rebuild it all the way up. Sometimes coding's involved, sometimes not. It kind of depends on what you're doing. With cloud, it's a lot of Lambda, a lot of containerized, CloudFormation templates, or just templates and blueprints from Azure, etc. So there is a lot of coding elements to it, but also at the same time, just understanding the concepts and how to break them down and build them back up. That's where I would start, I would say.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think what you're saying is you have to have an analytical mind, right? Like you have to be able to like think critically on how to, as to your point, do I implement something within the reality of my working environment and kind of be that like gadget player, right? Like you just kind of got to make it work. Like it's your job to take the square peg and whittle it down and fit it into the round hole of like your reality.
That's how it feels.
I think yeah. That's an interesting way to put it. I think you're right. I think when I see like somebody who isn't as successful in the job, it's because they live in a rigid world of like, this is how things are done, and they're unable to like find ways to adapt.
Well, I mean, cybersecurity, we've had to adapt. At one point, we were strictly overhead, and a lot of what happened, so there was a convergence, I would say. So early 2000s, I remember my IT shop I worked for, we actually did our own patching. We didn't have a security team at all. Like, security was in-house. We had to do our own patching. We had to drive our own security solutions like firewalls, as such. So there wasn't really a, quote, cybersecurity. And this goes back to 2001 to 2004. Thanks to, I think, the Lazarus Group. Thank you for, I think, being the first ones to kind of, I think they were one of the first ones, but they were one of the first, I think, public ones before Anonymous came out, that really start saying, hey, these groups, these hackers who were just like script kiddies playing around, having fun, doing all this, playing around with stuff, and all of a sudden they started getting organized, and that really kind of started shaping in 2000, as well as, we started using credit cards and debit cards as well. So you kind of start seeing the trend of, well, people do bad things, and they're going to figure out a way.
Yeah. Yeah. It is funny to tie those moments of like evolution in consumer behavior to evolution in cyber. I hadn't really thought of that, like the rise in credit card processing precipitating the rise in cyber organized crime. But I guess you need a motivation, right? Like money is a great motivator.
Well, yeah, that's pretty much on your top of it. When you start talking about APT, the Advanced Persistent Threats, or the cyber criminal groups, money's going to be a high motivator. Always.
Yeah. So, James, you are involved with education organization now as well, and you're teaching. What is the course that you're teaching?
So it's called a cybersecurity bootcamp. So for 6 months, about 40 to 50, depending on class size, students, many were college students that got bachelor's or etc. They come in, and we have a program, a curriculum that basically starts out with GRC, governance and compliance, that leads into host OS like Linux, Windows, where we start talking about, show them how to use the environment, password security, and kind of really getting the students to understand the operating systems in play, especially early on. Then we start moving, I would say, into the, what's offensive security, web application security, what's a SIM, start looking at defensive capabilities and start really challenging them. It's pretty fast. I would say it's fast paced. I didn't have a course like this. I even found value there. While I was teaching, it was reminding me of things I think I forgot like 5-6 years ago. But it's a really great experience. I think on December 19th, I graduated. I think about 40 people. And the funny thing is, week in, week out, they get pretty much homework, and it's go. Like, I'll teach 3 days a week for about 3 hours. It's just warp speed. Yeah, it's pretty fast. It's military's boot camp is same thing. You have to, either you keep up or you're gonna be lost. That's how boot camps work, right?
But, do you find that is that something that is complementary to somebody getting, you mentioned folks who have degrees in cyber, or do you see it as, I guess it's not an or, it could be an and, could somebody be successful who doesn't have prior, cyber training?
So even, bachelor's, I did information security, which is significantly different cyber because it's all about more information, personal, information security, versus cybersecurity, which is more, everything. It kind of information security folds up inside of cybersecurity. So it kind of depends on how you take it. When I look at theory, and when I talk about EDX in the bootcamp, it's practical. So when you go in to do college courses, you're really doing more of the practical learning, or theory learning, theoretical, more of, I would say, science-oriented, versus, for example, when you come to the boot camp, it's more, hey, can you set up this web application via container, and then, use the OWASP, the vulnerable application. I won't say it. This is for a podcast, but using those tools, setting up the tools and using the tools versus when I was doing more of like my bachelor's and master's, I was writing papers. I wasn't really doing cyber security, like hands-on approach. So it's definitely this course, the boot camp's more of a hands-on, learn, and then excel. Now to answer your question, either or. I think at some point you have to get hands-on with the technology to really be successful. I think that's paramount. On-the-job training used to be, I would say 10 to 15 years ago, we loved it. And all of a sudden I've seen in the last probably decade where if you look at the job boards and everything, I'm seeing a drastic decrease of like, let's get people in and train them, right?
Yeah.
Training's more like you need to learn before you get here, not, while you're here.
Well, and I guess to your point, right, like these programs didn't really exist. So, if you don't have a path to get trained, employers kind of have to accept that they're going to have to train people.
Yeah, it's passion driven. I mean, how did you even start playing with cybersecurity?
Well, so I had a job at a college at Verizon. I was supposed to be a network engineer, and I just was really, really didn't love that type of work, like the type of work I was doing, and was kind of very fidgety and made some friends in different parts of the company. And somebody was like, "Hey, I've got this project. You can come work on over here using this like big data tool. We're trying to run some reports or something." And it was part of the cyber organization, but like, I didn't know anything about cyber really. So I started, working on this project and, playing around with analytics tools, and turns out I was like really good at it. And I just moved over to that team and started figuring out what they were doing and figuring out how to leverage the data that they had to like pump out like interesting insights. And that got me into kind of like their managed services, doing like analytic work there. And yeah, I just kind of bumped around doing various like odd jobs related to some analysis, some analytics, some like analytic strategy. And then eventually I got a job at Booz Allen as like a SEM engineer. And that just, I think I was pretty good at Verizon, but I was kind of like the odd man out. Like about every 6 weeks, it felt like I was on a new team. Part of it was probably me. Part of it was probably them trying to figure out what the heck to do with me. But then at Booz Allen, I really kind of hit the stride of, hey, I'm pretty good at these SEM builds, pretty good at, this cyber analytics business. So I come at it from a very, like, have the network background, have some, like, technology background, but more from, like, a theoretical perspective, not necessarily from like a coding perspective,
Right.
or more of like an engineering perspective, and then came in it from like an analytics view, and picked up the rest of the skills I needed along the way. And it's kind of funny because I look back at that experience and thinking like, how on earth did I break into cyber, not having any of like the traditional skill sets, not knowing about cyber threats, not knowing about like technology or really like big IT infrastructure or anything like that. And I parlay that experience into the advice that I typically give people, which is you need to have a skill. Like if you have a skill that's valuable day one, then you get the opportunity to acquire like the other skills that make you even more valuable and give you opportunities to like move into various like parallel, disciplines and stuff like that. The thing that drives me crazy about people today, I meet so many aspiring, cyber, like career-oriented folks, and they all tell me they want to be red teamers and pen testers. Like, oh, what do you want to do? Red team or pen test? And like, cool. Like, you've
Yeah.
got to be really good at a lot of things, to do that well. Like, what can you do today? Well, I understand, how to use these analytics tools, or I understand, how to do like threat analysis. Like, great, go be a security analyst and build those other skills. Like, don't worry about, the prestige or whatever of the day one job. Go there, build the skills, get the hands-on experience, figure out how to, like, the other things that you need to be good at to go be a pen tester or to go be a red teamer. And that's the advice I followed without realizing I was following it. So, I guess take it with a grain of salt. But
It was
yeah,
funny.
I love what you're doing with the experience,
What's that?
because I think that's the thing that's so hard to get in a lot of these programs where you're like writing papers. It's like, how do I get good at something that I can do day one? Because nobody's going to hire me to write a paper on, database security.
I mean, it took me quite a bit of years to be able to get to a point where I'm actually, writing strategy. I mean, that takes, you're not going to write strategy or even documentation day one. You're probably not going to do documentation, let's say, probably year 3 or 4, maybe, depending if how, I would say, depending on the organization, if they're pushing to get analysts and other people on projects to do, deliverables and such. So, I mean, with my students, I did try to, like, look, there's a red team's good, offensive security is great, but there's a huge need in defense. We're looking at AI, we're looking at automation, we're looking at things in the industry to make our lives better as cybersecurity professionals and try to help us fight the battles that we fight every day. They need anyone coming into cybersecurity need to understand that we're all a mixed bag. We had different paths getting here. It's not your typical, hey, go to college, be an intern, and then you're going to land a job in cybersecurity. Most of us that I would say majority of people I've known in cybersecurity were more of tier 3 IT, like tier 3 IT and then tier 1 cybersecurity, and then went up that track. So it's a long track.
Yeah. Yeah, that is for sure. But I think it's also kind of one of those things like, you put your nose to the grindstone and you figure stuff out and you get skills. Like, it can be more of a meritocracy than a lot of other careers, because there's so many people out there who just, you need people with skills, you need people with experience. And like, I've always thought, like, as fast as you can gather those skills and that like capability, like, you can move as fast as you want. Like, as long as you're willing to put in the work.
I've seen many organizations struggle with training. And what I mean by struggle with training is we want to spend a lot of money in training, but what we're hesitant to do is, how do we validate that knowledge? Organizations spend all this money. How do we actually validate that cost is actually producing the desired results? I see that being a challenge, and pretty much every organization I've walked into. We want to give everyone training, but then when the reality is well, what's the cost benefit? And most can't tell you. Most, a lot of times it's, well, I mean, they'll tell you what they know.
Yeah. This sounds bad, but I used to get requests all the time for people to do, like, to go to conferences, and I never thought of it as training. I thought of it as like a week of like paid vacation, right? Like, all-inclusive trip to Las Vegas to, go to Black Hat or DEF CON or Splunk Conf or something like that.
Man,
like,
what
you're
the
probably
Black
going to
Hat
learn
in 2020?
something, but like, cyber's stressful, right? It was also like just the release valve of, being able to go somewhere and enjoy yourself.
Well, so in 2018, I went to Black Hat with a group when I was at GE. I learned a lot. Actually, I would say probably the biggest positive out of that experience was the social networking piece. So I did a automating defense class that was geared around cloud. So I was there a few days early before the actual main conference started. But overall, just that training and leading into the conference, I'll tell you this, that probably at night, the after parties were fun. But the reality is there was a lot of social networking. I met a lot of people. And that's actually helped me in my career as well, because I still keep in contact with a few of them.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Cyber is such it's such a big community. I don't know many other industries where like people across, competing companies are so, willing to collaborate and so like, cordial, because there's no like competition. Like you're not competing with anybody. You're
No, I mean,
everybody's
if you're
kind
going
of in
for
the same
Mandy,
fight.
if you're going to Mandy at the CrowdStrike, maybe there might be
Yeah.
some. You might see that, or if you go for like Booz Allen to Deloitte or somewhere of that nature, some of those competing. But when it comes down to like companies or businesses, not really. I mean, most I've seen, you'll have a CISO or security leadership go from one company to the next, and you'll see people go with like everyone creates their own security teams, and like this moves to like companies.
I've seen a lot of that. It's like a football coach moving to a new team, right? It seems like half the staff goes with them.
Right.
Well, James, I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. I love this topic. I mean, near and dear to my heart and work that I've done. And thanks for sharing your experience. Before I let you go, anything that you want to plug or give a shout out to?
No, I mean, I appreciate you inviting me on. I'd come back again. I love talking cybersecurity. It's a passion of mine. I would say any of my students that watch this, I'd like to see them do podcasts, and hopefully one day.
Awesome.
I really appreciate it, and congratulations on becoming a dad.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's been a fun couple of weeks. And hello to all of your students out there. So, James, it's been a pleasure. And I'm sure we'll talk soon. Take care.
Appreciate you. Thank you. Bye.